Hello and welcome back to the week 10 of our React.js series on state management and event handling. In this part, we'll be learning one of the most powerful and essential React hooks, the useEffect hook. So far, we have looked at how state and events make our application interactive, but in real-world applications, our components often need to do things that go beyond rendering the UI or responding to a user input. For example, we might need to fetch data from an API, start a timer, or listen for a window resize events. These are all actions that happen outside of React's normal rendering flow, and we call them side effects. In this session, we'll understand what are side effects, why React gave us a dedicated hook for handling them, and how can we use useEffect hook safely and efficiently. By the end, you will see how this hook let us synchronize our React components with the outside world. Here's a roadmap of what we'll cover in this session. We'll begin with discussing what a side effect actually is and in the context of React and why we need a special hook to manage them. Then we'll go through the basics of use effect hook, learning how it works, when it runs, and how to control its behavior. After that, we'll look at some of the common use cases like fetching API data, updating the document, or attaching event listeners. Once we understand that, we'll explore the cleanup functions, a critical part of use effect that helps us prevent memory leaks or unwanted behavior when the component unmounts or re-render. Finally, we will tie everything together with a quick demonstration where we'll build smaller timer application using use effect, and we'll wrap up the session by going through the best practices for using effects effectively in the real world projects. Let's start by understanding what we actually mean by a side effect. In React, a side effect is anything that affects something outside the scope of the current component or interacts with the external world. This includes things like fetching data from API, manual updating of DOM, setting up event listeners or subscriptions, and starting or stopping timers. These actions are called side effects because they don't directly compute or return JSX. Instead, they have an impact that extends beyond the component itself. React's components are meant to be pure functions. Given the same inputs, they should always produce same output. However, side effects introduce behavior that isn't purely dependent on the component's input. That's why React provides a dedicated hook, the use effect hook, to isolate and manage these effects so that they happen at the right time and don't interfere with the React's predictable rendering behavior. Now that we understand what side effects are, let's talk about the use effect hook itself. The use effect hook allows us to perform side effects in functional components, things like fetching data, setting up timers, or subscribing to data streams. By default, the code inside use effect runs after the component renders, which ensures that the UI is updated before any side effect logic executes. This is an important detail because it keeps React rendering process predictable. The basic syntax looks like the one given on the screen. The first argument in the function that contains a side effect, this could be a data fetch, a console log, or any other operation. The second argument is the array of dependencies that tells React when to run this effect. If the array is empty, the effect runs only once after the initial render. If it contains variables, the effect runs whenever those variables change. In short, use effect bridges the gap between React's declarative world and the real world side effects our components need to perform. Let's look at some real world examples of how use effect is used in everyday React applications. One of the most common use cases is fetching data from an API. For example, when your component loads first, you might want to send a request to an endpoint, get the data, and store it in the state. Another popular use case is updating the document title dynamically. For instance, showing the number of unread messages or the user's name in the browser tab. We often use effect hook for adding or removing event listeners. For example, listening for scroll events or resizing the window. Now let's talk about when use effect actually runs. There are three key moments. It runs once on mount when we pass an empty dependency array. It runs again on update whenever any variable in the dependency array changes. And finally, can perform a cleanup before the next effect runs or when the component unmounts. The cleanup step is where we remove any subscriptions, event listeners, or timers that we set up earlier to prevent unwanted side effects after the component is gone. The cleanup function is one of the most important parts of useEffect. Whenever we set up something that might continue to exist outside the component, such as an event listener, an interval timer, or a subscription, we need to clean it up whenever the component unmounts or before the effect runs again. Otherwise, these leftover processes can keep running in the background, leading to performance issues or memory leaks. The cleanup function is simply a function that we return from inside our effect. For example, as given on the screen, in this example, the timer runs when the component mounts, but when the component unmounts, React calls the cleanup function which clears the interval. This ensures our app stays efficient and does not perform unnecessary work after the component is gone. It's good practice to always think about whether your effect needs a cleanup function or not. Now let's switch over to a quick demonstration so that you can see use effect in action. We'll build a small timer application that starts counting seconds as soon as the component mounts. All right. So in this demo, we will see how do you work with side effects in React, right? So what are basically side effects? Side effects are anything that happens differently from the normal rendering flow of a React application, right? So for example, a React component, any React component, or the whole idea of a React application is to render a particular component that is based on the return statement of the component, right? So the XML that we are going to return, that has to be rendered with all the functionalities and all the view objects. But when there are certain things that are apart from this, for example, calling an API call, setting up timers, clearing timers, all these things are something which are side effects which happen due to triggering of certain methods within the React component, which do not have to do anything with the view of the React component, right? So view part of the React. So in that case, what we do is we create these triggers which acts as hook. All right. And to handle these effects correctly, we have a hook called use effect. All right. So how do we learn use effect? We are going to learn it with the help of a timer application, right? So we'll see how a timer is set up with the help of a component and how it is cleared with the help of a use effect hook. All right. So in this, what we are going to do is, like the other demonstration I've done, I'll create a new component and then I load that component into app.jsx. And then based on that, we'll see how the application loads. All right. So what I'm going to do now is first I'll go to app.jsx and comment this student list because this is not what we're going to need now. All right. And we'll save it. Then I will go to the components and within this component, I'll create a new component called timer demo.jsx. All right, it says time demo, doesn't matter, time demo.jsx, right? Now we are going to define what this time demo.jsx will do, right? So first we are going to import the things that are required, absolutely required for this application. So we are going to do, since this is a component, and we are going to also set some of the state variables. So we will use state, right? So we'll import use state. And apart from this, we'll also import use effect. Okay, both of these are imported from array. Okay, all right. So these are the two hooks that we would need for setting up this component. Right. So next we are going to create the component itself. So it is going to be a function like the other ones, right? So if you see the student list, it is going to be a function. Similarly, it is going to be a function also. Function time demo. All right. And then we have the definition of this. All right. Now here we are going to set up certain state variables that are required for this component. So the first state variable is going to be the count or the seconds that we are going to count, right? So this is going to be a timer application. So we are counting the seconds. So let's say I'll create a variable called seconds and then the modifying function which says set seconds. Okay, set seconds. And we are going to initiate it with the help of use state. Set it up as, let's say, 0. Or the second state variable is going to be is active, right? So this is something that will keep on toggling and help my timer to start and stop, right? So this is going to keep on toggling. So if it is a toggler, if it is a Boolean, I'll write it something like this: is active, and then the modifying function set is active. All right. And we'll give it a initial value as false. All right. So this is going to be a Boolean, right? Give the semicolons if you need. So these are my state variables. Okay. Let me also write this. State variables, and then we'll comment this so that we keep a note of it. All right. The next thing that we are going to write is the component itself, right? So the return, the XML part of the component. Okay. So let us do that. It's going to be a return, and a return within this component, we are going to create a div tag. All right. Within the div tag, we'll just give it a heading. Let's say H2, which says timer colon, and then we are going to, mention the seconds that it takes. Seconds. Right? And this is going to be seconds again. So let's say if the value is 0, it will say 0 seconds, 1 seconds, and so on. Right? So this line, this H2 will represent the seconds that have passed once the timer or the counter has started. Okay. So the next thing that we're going to do is set up some buttons which will, start the counter, pause the counter, and reset the counter. Right? So we're going to do this with the help of a div tag. Within this div tag, I'll create a button. Within this div tag, I'll create a button. All right. And then the text of this button is going to be start. The text of this button is going to be start. All right. And then we will attach it with a on click event, on click synthetic event, and then set up the definition here. So what is going to be the definition? Either I can create a single function here on the top and then write just the function name, or I can directly write the definition here, something like this. So I'll give it an arrow function, and the arrow function will set a value to it. So set is active, and what it is going to do is simply set it to true. All right, so that is how my start button will work. Let me just give some space for this also. Right, so I could have written this into an entire definition outside and then simply use the name of the function here. All right, but what I'm also doing here is, since this is just a one-liner code, just setting up a value of a state to true or false, I can simply write it within the arrow functions. All right. So what will happen at this point is, let's say the moment I click on start, this set active will be set to true. Right. So this will be toggled. All right. Okay. So this is my first button. So the next button that I'm going to have is pause. Right. So the next button is going to be the pause button. Button. Again, I'll write on click button. Sorry, on click synthetic event, which is going to again set my is active value to false. Right. Set is active, and this is going to set it to false. So this is going to toggle, right? And the value is going to be false. Okay. And the third button is going to be the reset button, which will set whatever, let's say after 10 seconds, the count of the timer will be 10 seconds, right? But I want to set it to 0, all right? And set the initial value to, let's say, is active values to, let's say, false. So these are the two things that set or the reset button will do, right? So I'll just create this button, reset, all right? And let's say I'll give it the text as reset. And what is it going to do is we'll attach on the on click event. Okay, so this is going to be on click event. But now these are the two things we are doing, right? One is setting the seconds to 0, and second is setting the is active to false. So these are two things doing. Will become a bit tedious or cumbersome when you write here, right? So what I'll do is I'll just create a function, reset, let's say timer. All right, let me just correct the spelling, reset timer. So this is going to be a function which I'm going to define here on the top, right? So how do we define it? I'll just write const reset timer, and this is going to be an arrow function. All right, and here we'll define what is going to happen when you click on reset timer. So what basically happens? The value of seconds again goes back to 0, right? So I'll write set seconds, and then what is the value we are going to give it? 0, right? So this will set the seconds to 0, whatever value it was. After, let's say, 10 seconds, 100 seconds, does not matter. We will set it to 0. The moment reset button is clicked, the set The second value will be set to 0, right? This is the first thing. And the second thing that is going to happen is the set it is active. The second state that we have used is going to get set to false. All right. And that's all. So what is going to happen with this? First, you click on start. The is active is set to true, and we'll set up a mechanism which will trigger the counter to start counting. That is one thing. The second button, when you click on it, will set the is active to false, which will stop the counter there itself, right? So let's say after 10 seconds, it will stop. The moment I click on stop, the timer will stop. And then finally the reset button, which will initiate or reset all the values, right? So this will go to 0, this will go to false, irrespective of what it is. Okay, so these are the three things. There is one more thing that I want to add along with this is the second thing is disabled, right? So there is this attribute called disabled, which has two possible values, right? So it can be either true, something like this, or false, right? So let's say if I just simply mention disabled, okay, if I simply mention disabled, it will be disabled. Okay, I'll just show you with the demo, I mean, on the demo. So let me just save this. Okay, we'll save this and then we'll go back to our app.jsx and here we'll import the component, right? So import time demo. All right. Why do you think we are not getting this recommendation here? The moment I write time demo here, it should suggest me, right? The suggestion is not coming here. That is because if I go to the demo, I mean, if I go to this component and see this component is not exported, right? The function that I've created here is not exported. So I'll have to export it, right? So I'll write default, export default, and the function name that I've created, right? So it is going to be time demo, right? Now, if I save this, right? Now I go to my app.jsx and now let me try to bring that suggestion here. All right. So now you at the very first letter you see that it is suggesting me. All right, and this component I want to display right here. Okay, so I can simply write it as an element, time demo, and that's all. Right. Now let me just save this and run this application. Okay, so how do we run this application? We'll go to the terminal and here we'll write npm run dev. Okay, so my application is running now. I'll switch back to this place where I'll be coding mostly. All right, now I'll open this application. Okay, so this is where it opens. All right, so you can see that there are, 0 seconds with start, pause, and reset. Okay, please observe that the start button at this point is not allowing me to click, whereas the pause button does that, reset button does that, right? Something is happening when I'm trying to reset it. But the start button by itself is not allowing me to, press it. Why is that? Because of this attribute that I've written. All right, so if you go to the time demo.jsx and if you go to its second, so if you go to its XML part, you will see that this is disabled, right? Now this disabling is something that I want to come into my work. How is that? Let us see. So for example, if I go back to my demo, so what is going to happen? Let's say I want this pause to be disabled unless and until I start, right? Because that makes sense. I should not be able to pause or make pausing the timer if it is not at all started, does not make any sense, right? So I want this to be disabled when the timer is set to 0, right? If the timer is not on, if the count is not going on, right? But let's say if I click on start, the moment I click on start, this pause should become active because only after starting the timer, you will be able to pause it or you should be able to pause it, right? Reset button will remain a reset, or again, you can also use the same logic for doing that, right? So you can keep reset button to be inactive uh, till the point the counter is not started. But once the counter starts, you can set it to reset, right? But I'll do this for a pause. Okay, so let us see how we do this. Okay, so initially, now this disabled can be configured with a Boolean, right? So it can be configured with Boolean. How is that? Let us see. So for example, initially, what do I want to be shown? I want the start button to be shown, and I want the pause button to be disabled, right? I want the start button to be shown, and I want pause button to be disabled, right? So this can be configured like this with the help of, or this can be set or connected with to a Boolean, right? So the value of disabled will be true if the boolean is true. The value will be disabled if the boolean is false. We can set it like that, right? So the only state at this point which I feel can come here is active, right? Because it is the boolean, right? And I want it to be, I want this disabled to act according to the value of is active, right? So what is it? What I want, right? So let's say if the counter or if the timer is at zero, is at the initial state, I want start to be active, right? I want start to be active. This means I don't want it to be disabled, right? If I don't want it to be disabled, I'll keep it as false. Okay. This means if I'm trying to keep it as false, what should I put as in is active? What is the initial value of is active? It is false. This means I'll write is active. Okay. So what is going to happen now? Based on the value of is active, based on the value of is active, it will be disabled or not. If the is active is false, disabled will be removed. If the disabled will be removed, my start button will be actively shown. Right? That is going to happen. Now, following the same logic, let's say if I write disabled here, okay, at the initial state, my is active is false, okay, my is active is false, and I want the disabled to be shown. This means the value should be true. That's why I should not take is active, I should take the negation of is active. Okay, so when I take negation of is active, initially this becomes true, which then activates the disabled, which in turn disables the button to be pushed, right? Okay, I hope it has got this logic. Let me save this and see what shows on the UI side. All right, so you can see that there is the start button now being shown and the pause button is not shown. All right, initially the start button was showing because I manually or without any condition I've just written disabled there, right? Nothing else. Okay, but now it works on the condition. It depends on the state variable. It has now been linked with the state variable. All right. Okay, now let us write the side effect. Let us write the code for side effect. What is the side effect here? The moment I click on start, my timer should start. Okay, now what exactly is happening within the timer that sets up the side effect? Why? What exactly is the side effect? Now let's say if I want to create a timer, right? Increment in the seconds happen after every second. This means I'll have to do something with the help of, this has something to do with set interval, right? So the set interval is basically an async method or a method which is async in JavaScript that allows me to work with some, time dependent methods, right? Time dependent procedures. If that is the case, does it have anything to do with normal rendering of my UI? It does not. If it does not have anything with the normal rendering of UI, what a React is meant for, this means it is a side effect for my React component. Okay, let me repeat the statement. If I am doing anything within my React component that does not, have direct relation with the normal rendering of my component, then it is a side effect. Okay, a normal rendering of the component would be how a component looks like, right? How our text printed on my component, how our functionality is added to my component, how our buttons looking, how our components plays within the component, right? Whether how are certain things positioned within the component. All these things are a part of rendering. All these things are part of view. With the view I don't mean vue, I mean VIEW, right? So with the view, all these things are dependent, right? But making a fetch call, making an API call at the backend, setting up the database, retrieving data from the database, setting up timers, all these things are things that are not directly rendered or directly used by the rendering way of React, right? Directly not bothered by or directly not affected by the normal rendering of React. If that is the case, and still if I want to do that with with my React, if I want to connect them with my React, they are connected as side effects. Okay, so for that, what I'll do is I'll go to my components, all right, and write about this. This is the place where I'll set up the use effect hook, right? So what is going to happen? There is a side effect, right? So first I'll write the side effect. So what is this side effect? This side effect is basically triggering the counter, right? So the counter or the timer should start when you click on the start button, right? Now, when you click on the start button, what is exactly happening? We are not directly triggering that function. We are triggering the value is active, right? So when the is active changes, when the is active changes, I want the effect to happen or the side effect to happen on changing of this variable, right? So whenever you come across an action where you want to trigger a function with a change of state, right? This is where the first thing that should come in your mind is the use effect hook. All right. So first we are going to do the use effect hook, but before that we will define the side effect. In our case, the side effect is going to be timer. So let me just define that and write const timer equals to, and then I will disable this. All right, const timer. There is going to be an arrow function, and what it basically does is it will first set a variable called as interval ID. Okay, the first variable that I'm going to create is interval ID, and just creating it, not setting it or initializing it with a value. All right, and then I will write this condition if is active, that is if the value of is active is true, if the value of is active is true, then you set up a set interval, right? So we will write interval ID equals to set interval, set interval. Now set interval takes a callback function and the time interval, right? So with how much delay do we have to do? So right. So what is the callback function in our case? I'll just create a callback function here. Okay, so the callback function is changing the value or adding the value of seconds by one, right? Changing the value or incrementing the value of seconds by one, right? So what I'll write here, I'll write set seconds because I cannot alter the value of seconds directly. I will write set seconds. And what do I want to do? Whatever is the current value or whatever was the previous value, I need to add one to it, right? So I'll get access to this previous, okay, previous, then I'll write previous plus one. All right. So this should be the action that happens when the interval is set, and this action should happen after every 1,000 milliseconds or 1 second. Right? This should happen after 1,000 milliseconds or 1 second. Now, how do we connect it with the use effect hook? Okay, so we'll first use the use effect syntax. So what is the use effect syntax? The first thing that you do is the side effect. Right? First thing that you write is the side effect. Okay, I don't want it to be an element. The first thing that you write is the side effect, and the second thing that you write is the dependency array. All right. So, what is this dependency array? It is the array of all the state variables with which or whose change would trigger the side effect. Right. It will be dependency array of all the state variables. Right. So, let's say if there are multiple state variables that I want the side effect to be dependent on, I can just write it as an array. That is the reason we write an array instead of simply one particular variable. Right? So this is going to be the syntax. Okay. In our case, what is going to happen? In our case, my side effect will be triggered whenever the is active value or the state of is active changes from either true to false or false to true. Right. So if there is any alteration in the state, my side effect should trigger. Okay. So how do I use it? I'll write use effect. Within this, first is the side effect. What is the side effect I'm going to write? It is the timer. Okay. The function that I've created here. And the second thing, it is the timer. And the second thing is the dependency array. First, I'll write the array. Okay. And within that is the state that on which I want this to be dependent. All right. So when I write is active, what is going to happen? The moment is active changes, the timer function will be triggered. All right. Now this use effect, whenever you present the dependency array to the use effect, what is going to happen? Uh, First time the use effect will run, and then finally it will be dependent on is active, right? So the dependency array. Let us save this and check. All right, let me just save this. All right. Now the moment I click on start, you can see that the timer has started. All right. So the timer has started. Okay, and it is going to increase after every 1 second. Now what has triggered that? This set interval, which was basically created as a side effect. All right, and it is actually changing the state variable seconds. Right. So with every change, it is going to add one value to it. All right. And what actually triggered this function? What actually triggered this function? When I click on start, the setting of is active value from false to true. Right. So it changed from false to true. The moment this change was detected, it triggered the side effect. All right. Now let us see what happens with pause. So nothing is happening, right? When I click on pause, nothing is happening. Although it is changing the value to false. The set active is changing the value to false. even though the timer has triggered, what is going to happen? This thing, this entire thing will be triggered only, will only be triggering, right? And only when the is active is true, right? So what happens when it is false? Basically nothing. So the timer that has started will keep on going on and going on unless and until you clear it, right? So to basically be able to clear it, we will have to write a cleanup function. Okay, a cleanup function is something that gets triggered. It is a function that gets triggered when the component is a reset. Okay, whenever the component is reloaded, it is the function that gets triggered. Okay, that is first thing. Second thing is whenever a component. Okay, in our case, what is the component that we are working on? Time demo. Whenever this component is unmounted or destroyed, just before that, my side cleanup function is going to trigger. All right. And how do I or where do I define my cleanup function? It is the return statement. It comes within the return statement of my actual side effect. Okay. So this my actual side effect is timer. So what is going to be the return statement of this? You can see in this function, it did not have return statement. It simply sets up the interval and the interval goes on. All right. We did not have a return statement. A function should not necessarily have a return statement. But in case a side effect has a return statement, right? That return statement will always have another function, another callback function, which gets triggered when the component is reloaded or the component is unmounted or destroyed, right? So what I want to do basically is I want to clear the interval, right? I don't want the timer to start or keep, keep on going on unless I close the component, right? So if you see at this point, if I just reload, okay, this will throw error at this point. So I'll just comment this, save this. All right. So if I just reload this, only then my timer will be set. Okay, only then my timer will be reset, right? So apart from reloading the component with the current state of code that you have written, apart from reloading the component, there is no other way I can close this or I can stop this timer. So at this point, my pause button does not make any sense to me, right? So when I start, my timer starts. The idea of pause button is to change the state from true to false, but my cleanup function does not handle it very well, right? So my cleanup function does not handle it very well because it does not do anything on setting up the false. Okay, so what do I have to do? I'll just stop this timer here. To make sure that this pause comes into picture, what I have to do is I'll have to make sure that there is a return statement. Okay, okay, so at this point, this part gets triggered. This part gets triggered only when is active is true. But if is active is false, nothing happens actually. My pause button is working fine. My pause button, the whole point of my pause button is to change the value of is active to false from true. That is what it is doing. But what exactly happens? And also my timer is running again because my value is changing. It is running again. That's fine. But it is doing nothing, right? It is doing nothing. So to be able to bypass this if condition, I will have a condition or I will have something that handles the false part, right? And what I want to do with this, I want to clear my interval, okay? And that should come as the cleanup function, okay? Because unless and until I write the cleanup function, my timer is not going to stop, all right? So what is going to be the value of cleanup function? Let us see. So this cleanup function is basically is going to be another function. It is going to be another function. All right. What is the whole idea of this another cleanup function? It will simply clear the interval, right? So it will, I can simply write clear interval. And then what do I want to clear? Interval ID. Okay. And just for the sake of, for the demonstration to know basically what got triggered, I'll simply log certain things here. Console.log. I'll write cleanup function cleanup function triggered, and we will write timer stopped. Okay, so this is the idea of the cleanup function. This is called as cleanup function. Let's just write it here also. Right. So whatever thing was initiated during the definition of within the definition of my side effect will be cleared here. Okay. And when will this get triggered? What is the trigger point of this function? Whenever my component either reloads, okay, whenever my component reloads, or whenever the side effects change, or whenever the component is destroyed or removed. Okay, there are two events, two things here. One is my dependency array or the state in dependency array changes. This is when this particular function will be triggered. And if my component is unmounted or destroyed or reloaded, that is also, that will also trigger this particular function. Okay. Even though the state is not changing, that will also trigger this particular function. Okay. Let us see. So now I reloaded. Okay. So I have a timer. The moment I click on start, my timer starts. All right. My pause become active. Okay. Now if I click on pause, it paused there itself. Okay. Do we have anything on the console? Okay, and okay, by the time, okay, you can observe one more thing here. I clicked on pause once, right? My timer stopped once, but you can see there are three times the cleanup function is coming, or at least twice. Okay, let me reload this component and let us see the messages here. Okay, do you see one more thing here? Now my timer has just reloaded. The timer has just reloaded. I have not even changed my, or I have not even started my timer. This means the initial value of my function is as it is. There is no change in the state variable. Still, it is writing cleanup function triggered. Why is that? Because my component is reloading. Okay. So whenever you write anything in the return, this function will be triggered at the reloading of the component. Okay. Why is that? Why is this getting triggered at the reload of the component? Because the useEffect hook by itself will trigger at once. Okay, at least once when the component is loaded. So the first clear interval or this console.log is coming because the moment I reload the component, or the moment I start the component, the moment the component is just mounted, this timer will be triggered. Okay, so this timer triggered is active is false. This part is completely bypassed. So I get this as a return. Okay, interval got cleared. Okay, but there was never an interval, so this will be ignored. And this is console. I mean, this is log. Okay, so the first trigger that I got is when the component is mounted. Okay, now let us start. When I click on start, let's see what happens. All right, so you can notice one more thing. I clicked on start, my timer started, but then again it says cleanup function triggers, timer stopped. Why is that? This is happening because this is happening because my dependency variable, or the variable or the state variable in the dependency array has changed. So if this has changed, my timer is triggered. The timer is triggered, this has also happened and this has also happened. All right. That is the reason I can see cleanup function triggered, timer stopped coming once again. All right. So my timer function is now getting triggered with every change in state. Now let us click on pause. So when I click on pause, what is happening? My timer stopped. My timer stopped, and you can see one more time this cleanup function has come. Why is that? Because the moment I clicked on pause, my is active set to false. That is, it changed from true to false. If it changed from true to false, this dependency has changed, which has in turn triggered my, my dependent or my side effect function. All right. Now again, if this was set to false, this will be bypassed and this function will run again. Right. So you can see, I'm just clicking the button twice, one for the start, one for the pause. All right. But my cleanup function triggered, or what this message is coming twice. Okay, so what are the three events, or what are the three stages when this function is coming? Once, when my component is reloaded, right? So whenever the component is mounted, whatever effect you have written, whatever side effect you have written will anyway occur. Okay, irrespective of whether you have clicked the button or not, whether you have triggered it or not, it will be automatically triggered. All right. The second one cleanup function is coming when you're starting the timer. So when you're starting the timer, again, there is a state change. This state of change is triggering my side effect. And the third time it is coming because of, again, the state is changed when I stop the or pause the trigger time. All right. So this means irrespective of what I provide in the state variable or in the dependency array, my use effect is going to happen once whenever, or this whatever function I'm writing here, the side effect is going to get triggered once whenever my component gets loaded. All right. Now, what if I do not provide anything here? What if I do not provide anything here? What is going to happen? Let us see. So when I do not provide anything here and I reload this, what is happening? The cleanup function trigger timer stop. What will happen? This, when you do not provide any dependency, when you give an empty array as a dependency array, the side effect will be triggered only once when the component is mounted. Okay, so this particular stage, when you're writing the timer function, okay, let me just write it here. This particular stage, when you're writing the timer, when you're writing the side effect with an empty dependency array, this means my side effect will trigger on mount. The second thing is when I have a state variable here. All right. So the second condition or the second version is I provide a dependency function. All right. And within the dependency array, provide a state. Okay. So what is going to happen? The side effect will be triggered on mount plus with every state change. Right. The very first example we saw, right? Okay. There is one more variation to this. Okay. There's one more variation to this. Let us see that also. So I'll comment this. I'll comment this. There is one more variation where I simply provide the side effect and do not provide anything in the dependency array. I just provide the side effect and I do not provide anything in the dependency array. What is going to happen then? Okay, let's see on the start. What is happening here? All right. So the function, my side effect function is triggering every second, right? The complete function is getting triggered every second. You can see here also, here also. This means it will just start and keep on triggering continuously. Here I just have a timer, so we can at least see a difference of 1 second. But if I do not provide the timer, if I simply log something, it will keep on logging with abrupt speed. Okay, and it is a serious performance issue, right? So that is what is going to happen here. In this case, abrupt triggering of the dependency function, abrupt triggering of the side effect, abrupt and continuous triggering of side effect. Okay, and obviously we do not want this. This is completely wrong. We should not do something like this. All right, so I'll comment this. All right, so that is about the use effect hook. All right, so you can see that I can use effect on three things or on a three different states. When I want to trigger something whenever my component is mounted, right? When I want to trigger something whenever there is a change in a now, whenever there is a change in the dependency array, and I want to trigger something whenever my component is reloaded or removed or destroyed, right? So what are the three stages then? If I provide an empty array as a dependency, okay, my side effect will be triggered only once whenever my component is mounted. Okay, it will trigger only once when my component is mounted. When I provide the side effect along with the dependency array, okay, my component will or my side effect will be triggered whenever any state variable is updated. Okay, and my side effect will keep on going abruptly and continuous changes when I do not provide anything. All right. So these are the three various stages and how do you use effect and trigger it. Okay. And the final thing that we're going to see is the reset timer. All right. And then if I click on reset, I will be initiated to my original value. All right. I'll be initiated to my original value. I know that the second has gone to 0, but with the reset, can I know, is there a way to see that the is active also has gotten false? Yes, this is this, right? So is active has gotten false, my pause button has become inactive. Okay. So that is how we'll see how to use effect, right? So trigger something at certain stages of the application, at certain stages of the component effect, right? Component mounting, whether the component is mounting, whether the component is updating, and whether the component is getting destroyed. Okay. So with that, we'll end this demonstration. Hope you understood it. Now we'll move back to the slides. Let's wrap up this session by going over some best practices for using useEffect effectively. First, always keep your state minimal. If you can derive a value from existing state or props, you don't need to store it separately in the state. This keeps your effects simpler and reduces unnecessary updates. Second, be mindful of unnecessary re-renders. If your effect depends on too many variables and references a new function every render, it might rerun more often than needed. Using techniques like memoization can help here. Third, be thoughtful about derived state. Only use it when it is genuinely represented a computed value. Third, be thoughtful about derived state. Only use it when it genuinely represents a computed value that cannot be expressed directly in the render. Finally, remember that every effect should have a clear purpose and if needed, a proper cleanup mechanism. When used correctly, useEffect keeps your React components clean, efficient, and fully in sync with the real world effects. With that, we'll come to an end of this session. I hope everything was clear. Thank you, everyone.